Welcome. We have Carly with us today to talk to us about sex and ethics in the Hebrew Bible. So Carly, I guess the most obvious question here would be, what characterizes or typifies the Hebrew Bible's ideas about sex and ethics?
All right, well, I'm not sure there is a single thing that actually characterizes the entirety of the Hebrew Bible's texts concerning sex and ethical behavior, ethical norms surrounding sex. And I think that's actually one of its greatest strengths, is this very diverse collection of texts recognizes the complexity of this very universal human experience and concern. So we have, for example, in the legal material, we have texts like Deuteronomy 22, which is a series of laws trying to deal with certain variations of a scenario in which a young woman is caught in having in a sexual situation before being married. And from our perspective, in some ways, it looks quite crude. Because what it's trying to do, so it talks about if the woman and the man are caught in the town, if the woman and the man are caught out in the countryside, then there's different kind of consequences which attend physically where that they're found, which at the first instance looks very odd. But then part of what's going on there is that what the text says is that in the town as opposed to the countryside, the woman might have screamed, but not, or would have been heard in the town, but might not have been heard in the countryside. So once we start getting into this, what it's trying to do is it's trying to distinguish between a situation of consent as opposed to a situation of non-consent. So from our perspective, where we have at least some more tools and skills and techniques to try and determine whether sexual activity is consensual or not, it nevertheless is recognizing the importance of consent for sex and sexual behavior. Okay? We then, if we move outside of the legal material, we might go to something like in Genesis, to Genesis 38, where we have this story, a quite crazy story of Tamar, who is married into this family, a family of Judah, and she's married to one of the sons who dies. They don't have any children. There is this expectation that then the second son will marry her and they should have children on behalf of the now deceased eldest son. The second son's not very keen on this idea and so kind of tries to avoid getting her pregnant and is, by doing so, displeases God and is struck down dead. So now there's the third son, and the father, Judah, is perhaps justifiably a little concerned about letting Tamar marry his now third son. He's kind of worried about this, so he puts her off. And what then Tamar eventually does, once this third son has reached adulthood, is she realizes that Judah's not intending to allow her and this third son to marry. And so she disguises herself and sits on the side of the road and essentially tricks Judah into thinking that she is for hire for her sexual favors. And so they engage in intercourse, and rather than sort of be immediately paid, what she demands is that he hand over his a couple of his identifying features, so his cloak and the stuff. So so then she disappears, and he goes looking for her to pay her properly, can't find her, and isn't quite sure what to do. As time will eventually tell, Tamar is discovered to be pregnant, and Judah, who has got her pregnant, but at this point doesn't know that he's the one who's got her pregnant, declares that she is to die as a result of this. So immediately what we see is the expectation that sexual activity outside of marriage, like we saw in Deuteronomy, is not acceptable. However, then Tamar produces these objects which clearly belong to Judah, and he realizes that he's the one who's done it. Now there are lots of kind of different factors involved here to do with gender and who and gender roles and ideas about who female sexuality belongs to, or who's its guardian. First the father, then than the husband. In this case, it seems to possibly be Judah in that role. But he clearly recognizes that that Tamar has been almost forced to this extreme behavior that wouldn't in ordinary circumstances be acceptable because of his own moral failure, his own failings. So he hasn't kept up his end of the bargain. He hasn't done what is right. And so Tamar has been pushed to fairly extenuating, extreme kinds of behavior. And so in this narrative text, we start to see the Hebrew Bible recognizing that, a very, flat, do this, don't do that kind of ethics of sexual behavior really doesn't work on the ground. That once life starts to happen, it gets a lot more complicated. So immediately already within the Hebrew Bible, we see a recognition that sexual activity, like many other forms of human activity and interaction, is, as far as ethics are concerned and moral norms are concerned, very complicated. So the legal material in Deuteronomy, the narrative material in Genesis, those seem to present, in different ways, they seem to present a fairly, what we might call patriarchal culture, a culture in which female sexuality in particular is circumscribed by the expectation that it's under the control of either her father or her husband. Things then even get more complicated, though, when we move to a text like the Song of Songs, where we have a series of poetic exchanges between a man and a woman. There's no apparent indication that this man and woman are married. There's no mention of her father. Her brothers do appear, and they do seem to reflect this concern about protection of female sexuality. But it's the picture as a whole is far more complicated and far less straightforward in the sense, that surely, her sexual behavior should be circumscribed for their sake. So she goes out, she seeks her lover, and they have this whole series of exchanges in both beautiful poetic language, incredibly vivid language. It's very bodily. It talks, both parties talk extensively about how much they love and admire each other's bodies. And so if we were thinking about sexual ethics of the Hebrew Bible from the perspective of Song of Songs, we might want to emphasize the importance it plays in highlighting the physicality of human sexuality and the positive light that it might shed on the bodiliness of the human experience.
Carly, it sounds like, from your description, it sounds like the Hebrew Bible's discussion about sex and ethics is both applicable to today and maybe not so applicable to today. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. There are certainly aspects of it which don't cohere with the way we, for example, think about women. So most people in kind of Western European, North American cultures don't tend to think of a young woman's sexuality as belonging to or to be protected by her father, which is then passed off to her husband. Mm-hmm. That said, most women in the Western tradition are still given away by their father on a wedding day. So there is an element of this. It's not as alien as perhaps it might look at first. So in some ways, we might use these texts to actually highlight some of the assumptions that we still make about male sexuality, about female sexuality, about the extent and remit of those sorts of activities. What I think the biblical text perhaps offers most powerfully for a discussion of contemporary sexual ethics is this recognition of the diversity and the complexity of this experience. That this isn't a human experience or part of human experience which is a simple issue which can be legislated in a few lines and that covers it. It's a recognition that it's a very complex topic, and so we do have within this canonical tradition nevertheless a recognition, ability to hold together a lot of very different ideas about sexual norms and sexual expectations.
Carly, thank you.